Good afternoon, everyone. I apologize for being a little bit late. It's busy times. I think about the fact that when we dealt with at least the budget challenges until January and February, I think many of us had hoped and expected that we might be able to go into the holiday season without all of these end of session antics, but unfortunately that's not the case. Let me hit on three items at the top so we can have enough time for plenty of questions. First and foremost, the decision that the Congress has to make about Ukraine. I can't think of a more historic mistake than for America to desert Ukraine at this moment of need. The Ukrainians in 21 months, to the surprise of the world, have held Russians at bay. They've literally destroyed close to half of Russia's military capabilities without the loss of a single American or NATO soldier's life. At the same time, if we were to walk away at this point, I question whether any nation state would ever trust America again. And alliances like NATO would be seriously undermined. A NATO that has expanded with Sweden and Finland because of the Russian threat. I also feel that I hear the absurdity of some of my friends who say, well, I don't care about Putin, but I care about President Xi in China. Well, if you don't get the fact that if Putin gets a green card in Ukraine, that gives a green card to President Xi activities in Asia, then you flunk geopolitics 101. Our Republican friends have brought a precondition that they never put in place under President Trump, under President Obama, under President Bush, in terms of assistance to our allies, in terms of border security. Listen, I realize the challenges on the border are immense. They've been immense for decades. One of the things the president's already proposed is close to $14 billion on increasing border security, processing these individuals on a faster basis. My hope, though, is that there needs to be policy changes. That's what my Republican friends have asked for. I support policy changes. We have to get our border under better control. I'm glad to see the president yesterday saying he's anxious to do policy changes as well. But we need to bring this to a head. And if it requires the president and Leader McConnell to sit in the room or their teams to sit in the room, whatever it takes to get this agreement in place so we can say to the world, and most importantly to the brave Ukrainians, that we're going to keep our promise, that we're going to keep our obligation, that we're not going to give a green light to Putin or autocratic regimes in China, North Korea, Iran, or anywhere in the world. So that has been enormously challenging. I can give an update later. I think there'll be questions on the Israel-Gaza circumstance. I'll get to that in the question period. But let me, two other items. Frankly, they're much better news than what we're dealing with on the international basis. This morning, our congressional delegation, along with the governor, were able to announce $729 million for the rebuilding and reconstruction of what's called Long Bridge. Long Bridge will more than double the passenger rail capacity on Amtrak. That takes our rail passengers not only to Richmond and further south, but this will increase rail traffic to Hampton Roads. It'll increase rail traffic to Charlottesville, Lynchburg, Roanoke, and ultimately to Blacksburg and beyond. But we've got to have that federal financing, and that only came about, that $729 million, because the bipartisan infrastructure bill. As one of the folks that was in the gang that put that bill together, I was extraordinarily proud. This is the kind of real change, the real movement forward to really provide a alternative to simply car traffic. Passenger rail is extraordinarily important, gives people a different alternative. VRE, in terms of transit, the added capacity is huge. This choke point of a Long Bridge that literally goes back to a bridge that was in the Revolutionary time originally built of wood. This has been a choke point for decades. We're going to finally be able to get it done. So great news for the Commonwealth and frankly for folks to the south and west of us who want to ride the rails. Final point, and Tim Kaine and I today or yesterday put forward legislation to actually rename the Roanoke Courthouse after a great civil rights, or let me make sure I've got all of the background here. Reuben Lawson. I mentioned that because Reuben, who grown up in Roanoke, worked with Oliver Hill, had helped lead towards desegregation of a number of schools across Southwest, I think is an appropriate name for that federal courthouse in Richmond. I'm sorry, in Roanoke. And our hope is our legislation will be able to move forward on that renaming. So why don't I stop there and turn it over to Laura and be happy to take your questions.
Our first question will be Allison Basil with 13 News Now.
Hi, Senator. I'm filling in for Mike Gooding today. We are actually taking a look. I know you weren't on the letter this time. We've talked about it with you in the past. Lawmakers, including Kaine, sent another letter to the Pentagon yesterday demanding more information on, I guess, the steps they're taking to improve military housing in the area. Obviously, still an ongoing back and forth problem, something you've also pushed to get fixed. So I just didn't know if you had any comment on that. Obviously, I'm sure you're still behind seeing these improvements.
There are a lot of issues that are frustrating. This will count in my top 5 issues of frustration, and that's making sure that men and women, mostly young, who serve to protect our country, don't live in substandard housing. We have this problem in many ways because way back in the 90s, there was an effort to privatize all of the military housing around the country. There was a short-term gain on that privatization effort. But the deal that was put in place didn't make sure that this housing had appropriate oversight to make sure that it was fit to live in. And we've seen mold, we've seen rat infestation, we've seen other insects and other things that just make it awful. The first time down at Lincoln Military Housing down in Norfolk, we had to take on, I think, around 2012. And what we found is we put pressure on the companies, they make some slight improvements, and then they fall back. We've put in place a military Bill of Rights to make sure that service members could defer paying their rent or have an ability to get improved housing if they're in substandard housing. But obviously, that still is not enough. I've basically come to the end of my rope. I wish that all of these contracts would be terminated or completely renegotiated, where we make sure that maintenance of quality housing is a right and a requirement, not a nice to have because you happen to have a magnanimous owner for a certain period of time. We're going to stay at it. Tim and I, the whole delegation in Hampton Roads has been on this. And let me just say, it's not just Hampton Roads. We've seen this bad housing down at Fort Lee. We've seen it up near Fort Belvoir. We're going to keep the pressure on, but it's more than a bit frustrating that just my personal involvement is now over a decade.
Senator, our next question is Michael Martz with the Richmond Times-Dispatch. Michael? Okay, we're going to move on to Mitchell Miller with WTOP.
Thank you very much, and thanks for joining us, Senator. Given what is at stake with Ukraine and Israel, do you think Majority Leader Schumer should keep the Senate in session beyond next week's scheduled break until there's an agreement?
Now, Mitchell, I do. Now, I know if my colleagues see this, they're going to say, hey, that's easy for you, Warner. You live close. And I do. I actually probably live closer to the Capitol than any member of the House or Senate. To quote Sarah Palin, I could see the Capitol from the 3rd floor of my house in Alexandria. But I can't think if honoring our commitment to our Ukrainian allies who fought with such vigor for 21 months against all the odds, if walking away because, as the administration has pointed out, the funding and additional artillery shells and tools for them to conduct the war, if that disappears, then Vladimir Putin is going to be able to dictate the balance of the war. So if that's not a national emergency, if that's not something that should keep us in, I don't know, well, candidly, what is. Now, I still think we were close enough last week where literally there were a dozen Democrats who said they might not vote for the bill because there were such policy changes. Now, those policy changes weren't in the legislation that was put forward yesterday. It just had the money for the border. But that shows to me that we were getting close in terms of meaningful policy changes with sufficient resources to make sure that we can stop the flow of folks who are coming into the country inappropriately. Like, for example, by raising the standards on which you can claim asylum. I mean, the vast majority of people who claim asylum, by the time they actually get litigated, they don't meet the criteria. So raising that standard so you can actually preclude people from coming in if they don't meet that higher standard is a policy change that I think the vast majority of us would support. I fear, though, Mitchell, that there are a lot of folks who are the loudest voices on the border who are the ones who will never vote for Ukraine aid under any circumstance. I think it's disingenuous. I think that many of them are following the lead of former President Trump in this kind of wanting to walk back America's commitments around the world. And I think that is a both short-term and long-term mistake. If we see Putin successful in Ukraine in a year or two from now, Putin moves on a NATO nation, Poland or the Baltic states, and American troops are then engaged, that would be a disaster. Let's stop this authoritarian land grab right now. And again, as we said, the Ukrainians are doing the fighting, not just for themselves, but for the rest of Europe and frankly for democracies all around the world.
Senator, our next question is Jad Khalil with Virginia Public Media.
Thanks, Senator Warner. Excuse me. I wanted to ask a question about Gaza. There's been thousands that have been killed just since the truce collapsed this last week. And this morning, a group of Virginians sent a letter to your office demanding support for a ceasefire. It appears as though the U.S. messages about civilian deaths aren't really working, and the Biden administration is sending really powerful munitions to the Israelis. Could you just explain how continued support in this manner is actually protecting Palestinian civilians?
Well, I can't think of a conflict since, again, I've been in elective office that is more heartbreaking than what's happened in Israel and Gaza. It started, and I think we should not forget, with the brutal terrorist attack by Hamas. 1,200 Israelis butchered and hundreds taken hostage. I've met with some of those families. I've met with one family that grew up in Virginia and that moved to Israel, that their son lost his arm in the attack at the music festival. I've seen the images of Hirsch being thrown in the truck with his arm profusely bleeding. I've also met with, from both the Richmond area and Northern Virginia, many of our Muslim Americans who live in, who are Virginians, and I've met with particularly a number of Palestinian Americans, and their horror stories are equally as heart-wrenching. One individual lost 35 members of his family, 32 of which were women and children. It's horrific. So I strongly support an additional pause. We are making progress. I do think the fact that Hamas did not continue to bring hostages over in exchange for the pause in hostilities was a huge mistake. There are still women and children, or at least women, that could be released. There are people like Hirsch who grievously wounded that could be exchanged as well. But I also think we need to keep more pressure on the Israeli government. One thing that I worry about is, as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, is the Israeli government has not provided the tax revenues they collect for the folks who work for the Palestinian Authority. The PA has had problems, but the Palestinian Authority security services are the only thing keeping the lid on what could be a second front in this war in terms of violence in the West Bank. So we have to keep the pressure on the Israelis. I think a great sign would be payment to these Palestinian Authority workers and the security services in particular. And I think we're going to continue to see the Biden administration, and frankly, many of us in the Congress, to say, you've got a right to defend yourself, Israel, and clearly Hamas cannot govern Gaza on a going forward basis. But the belief that one of the challenges is if Hamas becomes an idea, not a set of individuals, then it becomes even harder to eradicate. So I think we do need to see, I'd love to see a resumption of the pause with hostage exchange and cessation of violence. I do think we need to make sure we get those numbers on humanitarian trucks back up towards 200 trucks a day. And I think the Israeli government needs to go ahead and put out those payments to the PA. It's in their own self-interest, or we could have a second front in the West Bank.
Senator, our final question today is Amy Knowles with the Virginia Dogwood.
Well, hey, Senator Warner, thanks for taking our questions. I saw that you had some help in your Capitol Hill office recently trimming the tree. I wondered if you could talk a little about what you enjoyed about the students' visit this year and why this is such a meaningful tradition to you.
Well, God bless you, Amy. Thank you for asking that question. Starting my first year in office, we would, put up a Christmas tree. We'd also put up candles for Hanukkah, which starts today as well. And we would invite in kids from Northern Virginia. We had different schools come different years. This year was a group of kindergarten kids from Prince William County. And to see the joy they celebrate in the holidays, and we got a great tree that we've had. We've been taking trees from Grayson County for almost my whole tenure. A great Southwest Virginia Christmas tree. It's one of the tallest we've ever had. But to have these kids come in with their joy about the holidays, to put on ornaments that they've made, it gave me a welcome respite from the day job on a regular basis. And as we celebrate Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, other holidays, it is a spirit of family. It's a spirit of peace, and it's something I hope and pray that we see a lot more of all around the world. Thank you all very much, and I'm sure we'll get a chance to do this at least one more time before we hit the holidays. Thanks.